We're going to get started in just a moment. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to take the first 30 minutes of our call just for general updates and introductions. If you can share those just joining, your name, the congregation or community you represent, and the Indigenous lands you're on in the chat. Welcome to our first quarterly call as the Repair Network in 2022. We gather 4 times a year to share updates with one another, to cross-pollinate ideas, to come together in prayer and advocacy alongside Indigenous peoples in their protection of lands and waters, and to learn and share resources with one another, especially from resource people like we'll have in our panel tonight. So we're going to just take the first 30 minutes for some brief updates from the coalition. If we have time, we'll go into some breakout rooms where you all can share from your different communities that you represent what's going on the ground, and share with each other just updates from what you're learning and how you're acting right now. And then we're going to take the last 90 minutes for a really exciting panel discussion that I've been looking forward to on the theme of restitution in church budgets, which is one of the 7 steps of our Repair Network. So some of you may be new to the Repair Network. This is a way of moving beyond education towards action and repair alongside Indigenous peoples who are impacted by the doctrine of discovery. So we've done a lot of great educational work as a Mennonite church overall, and now we're inviting Mennonite churches and congregations to organize and to connect with our coalition in our solidarity campaigns with Indigenous peoples, like the Apache Stronghold, who I mentioned at the beginning of the call, as well as with a Maya group in the Yucatan, protecting their sacred lands and waters, and other groups across the world impacted by the structures of colonization that continue today. So we believe it's the responsibility of the church to take action and to move towards repair and restoration of the harms done under the doctrine of discovery. So I'm going to share just a really brief slideshow as a review for those of you who've already joined our Repair Network of the 7 steps of commitment once you join. And if you're in the early stages, I invite you to check out more on our website. You can fill out an interest form there, and I'm happy to come and present for your congregation or community about the Repair Network. And when you're ready, I'll drop a link in the chat. There's a super official membership form. We're church, right? So we've got all these forms and things to fill out. And that just indicates to us that you're ready to and have done some collective decision making as a community and are ready to join the network. So check out those links and determine as a group, with your community, so many C words, what level you're at, if you're just in the beginning of stages or if you're ready to join. So I'm just going to share really quickly from a Repair Network what the 7 steps are towards joining. So we launched this about a year ago, actually a little less than a year ago, through our coalition for Mennonite churches and communities. Now, our hope is eventually to be able to invite in others who want to join ecumenically beyond the Mennonite church. We've gotten some requests from other church communities as well, but we figured we got to start with our own people and generate this movement for repair within, and then continue to grow outwards from there. And join with other great organizing being done outside the Mennonite church and other church communities. But our 7 steps are, first of all, this is the only prerequisite to join, that you've got some kind of basic level of 101. What is the doctrine of discovery? Using our study guides, documentary film, resources from Mennonite Central Committee and other amazing resources that are out there to do some basic education with your church community. and to move beyond the head into the heart space, to really lament the impacts in your region and beyond. There's some great resources that connect with lament as well, that I could share with you, and that could be linked on our website. And then the next step really is to look within your community and say, who's going to carry this forward? How do we make this a commitment of our congregation to go beyond awareness raising and education? One step that some folks have done is studying and adopting the Statement of Solidarity with Indigenous Peoples from Mennonite World Conference, or drafting your own repudiation statement of the Doctrine of Discovery as a way of kind of organizing together and moving forward as a church community, and having some kind of a framework for doing that. And then beyond that, this committee kind of sends a representative to these quarterly calls, as well as to other events with our coalition, and is sort of a liaison with the congregation. Some of you have 3 or 4 representatives, which is great. One community has like 10 representatives, which I was surprised by, but hey, the more the merrier if you all want to represent your congregation. The next step, and these aren't necessarily in linear order, I want to say, but the first 2 are kind of prerequisites, education and then carrying the work forward in a committee. The next step is doing truth-telling and acknowledgement. And we invite you to work together on a land acknowledgement statement as an opening and not the end place for this kind of work. So that's really important. And that was spoken into when we created a land acknowledgement guide by Jim Bear Jacobs, who's on this call, and other Indigenous advisors who spoke into that resource. That land acknowledgements are not enough on their own. They're not justice or reparation. They are simply saying and recognizing these are the Indigenous people's lands whose home we are on, and letting that unsettle you and create some kind of allowing the discomfort of living on stolen land to carry the work forward, and exploring other forms of truth-telling. For example, some churches in Goshen right now are working on a signage project, memorializing, remembering the Potawatomi people who walked on that land for thousands of years, and Miami peoples, and who are still alive today and who've consulted on that project as well. So that's just another way of truth-telling and acknowledgement, but there are many forms that could take. And the one we're exploring today with our panel is restitution in the budget. So this step is really putting the money where the mouth is, and taking a step of active commitment as a congregation, where sometimes the other commitments can feel a little bit not necessarily easy, but sometimes when it gets down to finances, that's where the rubber hits the road, right? And our commitments are made visible. So this is one tangible way of returning wealth directly to Indigenous groups in your region working for land return, or other groups in other lands, depending on the history in your region of forced removals. There may not be a direct relationship possible with the Indigenous group. Oftentimes there is, with some work and research. But we also ask that you donate in addition to this, not instead of this restitution fund, that you donate to the work of our coalition so we can continue to organize. And we actually have a repair partner each year where we contribute over half of all donations towards our coalition, towards an annual Indigenous repair partner. This year it's Cacuchtal, a Maya community in the Yucatan. So we'll be sharing more about this step tonight, and getting into the nitty gritty of the how, the what, the who, and the why of restitution in the budget. The next step is responding to calls for solidarity with Indigenous peoples, joining the campaigns, like I said, that we're actively involved in, supporting work locally and on the ground with your congregation, growing the movement of dismantling the doctrine of discovery locally and internationally. And then finally, our second to last, connecting the work of repair with creation care. often this work is siloed in congregations. There's a community garden maybe, and then there's a social justice group working around the doctrine and discovery work or other racial justice and climate justice work. So this is a way of really bringing that together and looking at the roots of climate change and of the ecological crisis that we're in, tracing that back to colonization and some of the breaks in relationships with the land. And so finding ways to engage in earth care, or if you're already involved in that, connecting the dots with this work of dismantling the doctrine of discovery. And then finally, being contagious and spreading the word about this work for repair in all your spheres of influence. So we also like to say, like, the repair work isn't just outward, like this repair is also inward. Like this is for our healing and transformation within the Mennonite Church and our institutions as well. So I could share more about that, but I'm also happy to go more into detail in like a longer 15-minute presentation with your church communities and to have more of a conversation around what grounds this work, how this goes back to Jubilee and Jesus's call to a ministry of release and of justice and liberation for all creation. So I'll pause there, and I just want to say welcome to those of you who've joined since I started sharing. I've been just sharing the 7 steps for joining the Repair Network. And I want to ask those who have already joined or are in process, if you could go to this link in the chat. I'm going to put a link to the list of congregations who have joined or are in process of joining. And if you could fill out whose Indigenous lands you're on from your land acknowledgement statement, if you've done that already. We actually have a volunteer, Holly Liu, who is creating a map. She does GIS mapping for the city of Portland. So she's going to create a map for us to put on our website of the Repair Network congregations and communities, the Indigenous lands they're on, their websites, and possibly also in the future, like projects of solidarity, lifting up Indigenous-led initiatives in your regions that folks could connect to and learn about. And just so that people can see, just like there's a map of LGBTQ affirming congregations in MCUSA, for example, people can look on a map and see what congregations are involved and part of the coalition that I could get engaged with in my region, for example. So if you can fill in that info there, as well as if you know already, if there's someone from your congregation or community who's interested or able to attend our in-person gathering, fingers crossed with CDC guidelines allowing, this summer, July 22 through 25 at Albuquerque Mennonite Church. We're going to be gathering as a repair network that first Friday of that weekend from 4 to 7 p.m. Mountain Time. And that church has a strong relationship with the Pueblo Cultural Center and the Pueblo community there. There's an opportunity for kind of a immersion and education experiences in relationship with Pueblo peoples and nations in that region. So I invite you, if you're able to attend or send a delegate in person, it's going to be a really rich experience on the ground. You're going to be able to observe and be able to listen in on our coalition meetings if you choose, or else go out and do your own learning in the Albuquerque region. There's also some talk of being hosted for meals by the Pueblo community as well, for learning about food justice and food sovereignty initiatives. So it's going to be a really awesome gathering if you can come. The only required portion is this 3-hour section on the 22nd that will have a Zoom option as well if you can't come in person. But it's also a chance just to build relationships, get to know a Repair Network congregation, Albuquerque Mennonite, and what they're doing on the ground, and listen and learn from Indigenous peoples locally. So I invite you, if you're able to join by Zoom or in person, to just put that in the column there, especially if you know the name of the person representing already. So thank you for filling that out. I'm seeing folks doing that already here. I also just want to point folks, as you're filling that out, to Shalom Mennonite Fellowship's work on the ground, especially Pastor Carol Rose and Tina Schlabach recently went to Oak Flat in solidarity with Apache Stronghold for a pre-consultation meeting with a federal official. I've posted Carol's reflections on our blog at this link. So unfortunately, we don't have time to hear more directly from Carol tonight, apart from her part in the panel. But you can read more of her words and reflections from what they learned from that, what she's calling, or what they're calling a non-consultation that happened earlier this month or in February at Oak Flat. This is a sacred site that's threatened by a copper mining company that the federal government may be transferring the land to this company pending an environmental impact review and some court cases that are still withstanding. So we're calling on people in the Repair Network through our monthly prayer and action calls and other advocacy opportunities to respond to calls for advocacy. That you can find more details on that article. So I think we're going to now just pause. I want to pause and see if you have any questions. I've been talking a lot. We're going to start our panel in about 10 minutes. So if there aren't any questions, we'll take some time for some breakout group sharing really quick as a way of doing some intros to those of you on the call. All right, well, let's do some breakout rooms. I'm going to do about 3 people in each breakout room. And it's going to be automatic selection. So I'm hoping you're not placed with people in your same community or congregation. If you are, join our main room again, and I'll try sending you out to another breakout room. But if you could share what community you're coming in from, and maybe just from the seven steps that I've outlined, what step are you really working with right now as a congregation, as a perspective or member of the Repair Network? Which one are you maybe struggling with? Which one are you finding traction with? What are you learning along the way? We'll just take 10 minutes before our panel starts to share who you represent and which one of the steps you're currently kind of is most generative for you right now. So we'll go ahead and break out. And if you're not wanting to join, feel free to stay in the main room. You should see a link right now.
All right.
And thanks everyone for that cross-pollination time. I wish I could have been a fly on the wall in those conversations. Some folks are still rejoining. I'm going to see if I can spotlight you, Jim Bear, and Joel as our other panelists, and also Carol Rose, if she's back on, will be our other panelist from Shalom Mennonite Fellowship. So I'll just wait for her to join. But folks, as we are starting this panel, I invite you to be thinking of questions for panelists. At the end, we'll take some time for Q&A. You can feel free to put them in the chat. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat as things go along. Oh, there's Carol. Carol, I'm going to add you to the spotlight so we can have 3 panelists. And Carol, I believe you said you're the main representative tonight from Shalom Mennonite Fellowship. Is that right?
There are others here, but they want me to talk. Okay,
great. Well, this was going to be an informal conversation. So if there are folks that you want to tap, from your congregations present, treasurers or so on for, details for questions that come up, feel free. But let's kick it off with some questions for tonight. Just by way of introduction, I don't think I introduced myself in the beginning, but I'm Katerina and I'll moderate the panel. Would it be helpful for folks if I put my video in here when I'm talking? Let's see. I'm seeing some yes. Okay. Well, I wanted to just start off with a short story. I met Reverend Jim Bear Jacobs back in, when was it, Jim Bear, like 2017, 2018, at a Bartimaeus Kinsler Institute in Ojai, California.
Yeah, and it was right around this time of year too. I don't
That's
remember how
right.
many years ago, but
Yeah, February, I imagine a welcome break from Minneapolis or Twin Cities out in California. We did a workshop together in which Jim Bear shared on healing Minnesota stories. I shared on the Potawatomi Trail of Death and the different trails of remembrance and lament that we've both been in partnership with Indigenous peoples in our own regions around. And I heard Jim Bear speak as one of the keynotes at that event. One of the calls that he set forward to action for church communities present was don't just leave it at acknowledgement or at apologies, but what does reparations take? It takes some form of costly discipleship. Put restitution in the budget. And at that point, I hadn't heard of that call at all. And so that stayed with me in my consciousness until when we formed the Repair Network, I felt like this is a chance to put this into action. Putting restitution in church budgets as a tangible commitment. And so I've invited Reverend Jim Bear to share, along with two church communities who I learned about have been doing this for a little while and are setting some precedent within the Mennonite Church or within our denomination to put restitution in the budget. And they're doing that in different ways. So I think tonight is a good way to just learn from what models are out there. What are the questions that have been coming up? What are the motivations for restitution in the budget? And really hearing, especially from Jim Bear, from your work in the Twin Cities and in Minnesota and a statewide level in movements for reparations, some of your learnings and hearing from some of your experiences and wisdom as well. So just for the sake of introduction, maybe let's just start off with a word of intro for each of you. And we'll go in a circle, starting with Jim Bear, Carol, and then to Joel Miller. If you could share where you're located, whatever affiliation you want to name of the communities you belong to, and your different roles in those communities. I'll go ahead and let you start it off, Jim Bear.
sure. Ahu Kulumasi, ni Dijinji Makwa, Jim Bear Jacobs, ni Takdalangamau, ni Mohicanu, na Kakosatawa Kulumasi, Anishik. I give greetings to everyone who is gathered here today. I greet you as a relative. I introduce myself as Bear or Jim Bear Jacobs, and in informal capacities, which I would consider this, I just go by Jim Bear. I am a member of the Turtle Clan, and I am a citizen of the United States of America and of the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Nation, which is a sovereign indigenous nation, which is currently located in central Wisconsin. And with goodness in my heart, I extend my gratitude to each and every one who's gathered here today. It's good to be with you all. I always take when I'm on Zoom, I always take myself off of speaker view because I hate staring at a large picture of myself as I'm talking to people. So it's good to see 40 some people gathered here, and a number of familiar and friendly faces. So it's good to see Christy and John, Katrina, Katerina. It's good to see you again. And, Carol, good to see you again. We met just a couple of weeks ago. But I'm amazed at a gathering of Mennonites like this, and how many Mennonites I actually know and recognize from various spaces and capacities. which was not my experience growing up. You know, grew up within a very conservative church, and we really didn't have much to do with Mennonites. We kind of looked at you as like 2 steps up from the Amish, and didn't have much cause to interact. But I recognize a lot of faces from various capacities, and I'll say this: if our paths have crossed in some kind of significant way, chances are that means that you and or your community are engaging in some really serious work. And so I'm happy to see that reflected here. And my roles here, where I'm from right now, I'm living in just outside of Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I serve as the co-director for community engagement and racial justice for the Minnesota Council of Churches. I am an associate pastor at a church called Church of All Nations, which is a multi-ethnic, multiracial, medium-ish size community as part of the Presbyterian Church, the PCUSA, here in the Twin Cities. And yeah, it's good to be with you all. We're just to set your mind at ease. Some of you, you know, we're currently at 36 degrees here in Minneapolis. So we've finally, the last few days, finally have been melting some snow and had the return of some birds. And we are, I'm hesitant to say we're well on our way to spring, because, you know, we could still get 22 inches of snow dumped on us in April, but the horizon is in view. And so it's good to be with you all.
Thank you, Reverend Jim Bear. I forgot to mention that you were one of our Indigenous advisors on our recent resource that we released, Stories of Repair. So grateful for your consultation and help alongside our work on that resource. Over to Carol.
Yeah, thank you, Jim Bear, and for being here with us, and all of you here. It's so exciting to see this circle largen or expand. So I'm Carol Rose. I am one of the pastors of Shalom Mennonite Fellowship in Tucson, Arizona. We're on Tohono O'odham land that has also been, the Tohono O'odham have also hosted or otherwise lived with for centuries with the Pasquayaki and several Apache nations who come through here sometimes. And I also have been part of the Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery Network for a while, and give leadership to the network's work with Oak Flat. That is part of my pastoral work, but also just part of what I do when I'm not working. My people came to this continent centuries ago. We're part of the initial invasion from Europe on the East Coast. And I have only lived where I currently live for about 6 years, and have lived a whole bunch of different places following that kind of settler pattern of move and move and move in my life. Maybe I'll just stay here now that I'm learning better. Am I supposed to answer anything else?
I think you got it, Carol.
Right.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll pass it to Joel.
Everybody, good to see you. Joel Miller in Columbus, Ohio. More specifically, in my daughter's bedroom. After 2 years of the pandemic, I still don't have a good place in our house to do Zoom, so I just a floater in here. And oldest daughter's bedroom is the most quiet place for now. I've pastored Columbus Mennonite in my 9th year. Yeah, I mean, that's my introductory, that's just the brief introductory marks there.
Thanks, Joel, and thanks to each of you for your intros. So let's get into this conversation with just sharing the why behind restitution and church budget. So starting with Jim Bear, and we can continue this circle. Feel free to pass at any point if one of you wants to wait till the next question. And but I'd love to hear from each of you and your different perspectives. Why do you call for and work for restitution in church budgets? Where does that come from for you?
Well, I guess I'll start out since I have been, to use an appropriate but bad metaphor, I've been banging that drum for a number of years now. And the genesis of that, the source of calling for churches to actually put this in their budgets is, quite frankly, if I can just kind of just say it, I am tired of being your mission field. Just stop it. And typically engagement for Native peoples from a church to Native peoples comes out of some type of mission department. And if there is a transfer of funds, that generally comes out of a benevolence fund or some sort of special offering or a charitable giving. And we as Christians, we fool ourselves if we look at that and think that we're doing any kind of justice work in the world, because it's just, we have to disavow ourselves of that foolish belief. And so I tell people, and the source of this, kind of the genesis of this, as an attempt at repairing the devastating effects of the residential boarding school system. I've lost count of how many churches I have given this charge to, but I say a significant portion of your budget as a church should go to Indigenous language and cultural reclamation programs in your area. Because, my own grandmother is a boarding school survivor. Her father, my great-grandfather, was actually taken out to Carlisle, which was the model that the US government utilized to establish kind of this residential boarding school program. And the sting, the damage, the trauma of that boarding school system is, it's a proximate part of every Indigenous person in the country today. And I say that without qualification. I say that without any hesitation. There is not a Native alive today that is not more than 3 generations removed from a direct trauma of the boarding schools. And we know that these were places of genocide. These were places of cultural and physical genocide. And if we're going to be about, as people of God, as followers of Christ who claim to believe in a salvific work that includes things like healing and repair, then we ought to do that. And to do that, it has to be an obligation. It can't be charity. Reparations cannot be doing more charity better. Reparations has to come out, the idea of reparations needs to move out of the charitable spheres, and it needs to be placed into the justice spheres. And we have ample examples out of scripture for this. When the Israelites were coming out of slavery in Egypt, The Egyptians gave to them as they were leaving. They gave them gold and silver and hand mirrors and all of these things. And no one would look at that and say, oh, you know, the Egyptians took up a special benevolence offering to give to the Israelites on their way out. No, this was reparations because injustice had been inflicted. When we look at Jesus and his call to Zacchaeus, and what must Zacchaeus do to be whole, to find salvation? Well, Zacchaeus has to sell all that he has and repair and remunerate and restore. And we don't look at that story and say, oh, you know, Zacchaeus was a very charitable individual. He wasn't. Zacchaeus had been confronted with his injustice and was shown a path towards repair. It was an obligation for his wholeness, for his humanity. And so I say we put it in the budget. I want it in the budget because I want at every annual meeting, I want you to wrestle with this. I want this to be as much of an obligation as you are obliged to pay the electric bill, the gas bill, payroll, salaries, all of this. And so that's my thinking on it. You know, so just to kind of circle back, the how I arrived at this is, you know, I am tired of being the mission field. I really am. And so I don't want your charity. I'll take your reparations, but it better not come from a handout of charity.
Amen. Should we just follow?
Feel free to jump in, Carol. Yeah, thank you, Jim Bear.
Thank you. So when I was thinking about scripture, the one that keeps coming to my mind is do justice, love mercy, walk humbly. There's something in that combination that calls to me as a settler the need. I think there's a particular way that the decolonization for me requires me to learn to walk humbly, but to start with doing justice. Yeah. There's a more like tangible how we got there that's not particularly, I mean, it's deeply biblical because it's following Jesus, but it's not like one text or something that called us. Ken Schilt, who is on this call, was in a book study of Buffalo Shout, Salmon Cry. And then we did a month-long worship series and study series on the doctrine of discovery, and hosted the play. We own this now. And then Ken said, I was about to like propose at the next congregational meeting that we make a statement against the doctrine of discovery, but Ken beat me to it. He said, let's put our money where our mouth is. And then Ken and Earl researched. We were going to start with how much would we pay if we had to pay taxes, which of course churches don't always know. And we were rather astounded that that was like more than we imagined we would have to pay if we were paying taxes. And it didn't. So we're paying about our restitution budget line is about 1/10 of what we would pay in taxes if we had to pay property taxes on this land, the land that we are responsible for at the moment.
Thank you, Carol. Anything to add, or feel free to jump in, Joel?
Yeah, our path to this, so I think you asked, why do you call for restitution in church budgets, or why is it in our church budget more specifically? So our path to this came, I would trace it back a long ways, but a marker would be 2016. So for us, the Black Lives Matter movement for Black Lives is our path, at least the door into this. We did a year-long study worship focus throughout that year. We kind of had consensus as a congregation that we were going to go more in depth with that. And throughout that, I learned a tremendous amount doing theology by the seat of my pants, as one of my seminary professors called it, and my own learning. And just developing language around white supremacy and kind of just coming to terms with history. So we studied things like Jen Harvey's book about Dear White Christians, about this kind of this transition from a reconciliation model to a reparation model, recognizing power in differences and coming to terms with history again. Learning the story of the Black Manifesto in 1969, when James Foreman called on predominantly white Christian and Jewish congregations to pay reparations to Black Americans. And so there was kind of that track, and then developing a land acknowledgement, being a part of those conversations, and having the language there in front of us, which I think on the website here, their pair network, it kind of holds that in front of us, as in like, so what are you going to do about it? You know, it's like you just remind yourself every week about this commitment, this open-ended question, which I think is really important for us to hold in front of ourselves. So I think putting it in the budget, I don't know if this is the right place to speak to the specifics of that, but I think it asks the right kinds of, it gets us asking the right kind of questions and going really deep into personal storytelling, like family history and church history. So for example, our church building is located on land in the 1930s that was green lined in the redlining era. And still shows the prosperity out of from that effect, and some of the indigenous history. Long ago, we were kind of center of the Hopewell, what Europeans called the Hopewell peoples. That society was just south of Columbus, and Shawnee and Miami folks came through as well after that. So yeah, that storytelling and exploration together led us toward the actual budgeting, which I could say more about later, because I think that's where we're headed.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. That's right. We'll get into the details in a moment. I wanted to kind of start out with the big picture of the why behind what we do before getting into the what. But did any of you want to add? I appreciated, Jim Bear, your biblical framing. That's not a well-known text on reparations, that the Israelites were given gold and silver by the Egyptians. You also brought up Zacchaeus. I imagine there's some pastors in the group listening in who may want to be preaching on this theme as they invite churches to get on board. What other texts or theological groundings would you all offer from your own work? And any other ones, just for a minute or two, to share about the why behind what we do biblically and theologically?
Yeah, one guiding text for me that I just I can't shake it all, and it's just really kind of theologically shaken me, like spiritually shaken me. Matthew chapter 5, we all know it as the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes in that, but in that same teaching, So Jesus from the same mountaintop has this little like two-liner in there. And he's addressing the crowd, and he says, if you are bringing your gift to the altar of the Lord, and there you remember that your brother or sister has a grievance against you, stop. Don't present your gift. Leave it. First, go and be reconciled. First, go and make repair. First, go and fix the grievance, address the grievance. And only then, I'm paraphrasing, but only then come back and then offer your gift to the Lord. You know, and I grew up in a fundamentalist Christian denomination. I've read my Bible cover to cover every year throughout my adolescence. So, you know, I'm a good Sunday school boy, you know, and this passage never ever registered with me at all. And when I started getting involved in justice work and came across this passage again, this was, forgive me, this was a holy shit moment for me. Because if we look at it in context, the religious context of first century Judaism, presenting your gift to the altar of the Lord was the defining act of your spirituality. It was what you did to establish yourself as a child of the covenant. It was the central act of worship. And so I want you to picture that we're all gathered in sacred space. We've got the organ or the piano or the guitar, you know, however you are ushered into worship, but worship is starting. We're all getting into the spirit of this. And all of a sudden Jesus busts in and says, stop, don't do this. Your brother or sister has a grievance against you. We know that, right? That's the whole that's the whole point of truth telling, is that those grievances of which we were once ignorant, we can no longer be ignorant of, because we are lifting up the hidden voices and we are listening to these difficult stories. So now we're aware of the grievance. We have no right to call ourselves children of God unless we address the grievances. And I mean, that has shaken me, and I take that to heart. And I think about all of the times where I have been in spaces that have been quote unquote holy spaces, right? Where we are ushering in the presence of the Lord through worship and word. But the community doesn't give a damn about the Black lives that are dying in the street, doesn't give a damn about Native children, doesn't give a damn about missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I look at that and I say, we were just banging gongs and empty noise. And so I you know, those two lines, or two or three lines in Matthew chapter 5 has fundamentally reshaped my approach to ministry.
Amen. Thank you, Jim Bear.
Amen.
Rachel, anything to add to that? That's powerful reframing of that often missed passage in the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah, there's one that recently has been, I mean, for a long while has called my attention, but recently has been calling me, and particularly in the area of Indigenous solidarity, is noticing that when the conversation that the Canaanite woman had with Jesus, so by the Hebrew scripture's own telling, the Canaanite woman is an Indigenous woman. And the conversation started off very poorly. Jesus called her a dog. And then she like the grace extended by so many Indigenous people to us settlers, didn't shut up. She called him on it, and he listened, and then he did what she asked. And that turnaround is more of a model for me of following Jesus than a Jesus that got everything right in the first place. So listening and doing what they ask seems to me to be how to follow Jesus when interacting with an Indigenous person. And may we skip the first part.
Yeah, to build on, Jim Bear mentioned the Exodus 12 passage about the Egyptians, the Hebrews pillaging the Egyptians on their way out. There are some medieval, I don't have a reference, sorry. There are some medieval Jewish interpretations of that specifically note that those were not gifts, that was back payment for unpaid labor, as far as a framing of those, what they gained in that exchange. They had coming to them from centuries. There's stories. I mean, the theme of land and covenant and migration and movement, as Jesus just like woven throughout Scripture. So there's so much so much depth there. Even stories of really bad examples of the story of Ahab coveting Naboth's vineyard and arranging Ahab and Jezebel conspiring together to arrange for Naboth's murder. And then just using their power to claim that land, and then Elijah being prophetic and confronting that, and that getting there being conflict there. I mean, that's a great story about coveting and relationship with land and power dynamics. A couple stories that have been meaningful to me. So I practice Columbus Mennonite Church, and we're named after Columbus. So like the way that we press these names onto places, there's a story in that story when Jesus said, "Who do people say that I am? Who do you say that I am?" Took place in Caesarea Philippi. So being under the control of Herod Philip at the time, who named it after himself, and Caesar, to whom he was loyal. So this name pressed onto this place. And that after that kind of exchange, Jesus saying, if you want to follow me, take up your cross and follow me. And the cross kind of Rome's use of the cross. Basically, Jesus calling for this disloyalty with one's covenant with Rome is kind of where I'm getting with that story, of spaces being defined by names and the power around it, and Jesus called to be disloyal to that power. And so I relate that to being disloyal to the narrative of white supremacy and of doctrine of discovery and manifest destiny, and those kinds of covenants that we silently make with one another, or that we're not aware that we even made, but we come to recognition that we are in this covenant, and how do we be disloyal to that? Another story, I think the Bartimaeus Cooperative was mentioned recently. That story of Bartimaeus as Jesus enters Jerusalem, the constant gospel theme of perception and perceiving and not perceiving, at one point became clear to me that the Black American cry of "I can't breathe," that my cry in response is "I can't see," and truly I can't see what you're even saying. I don't understand. I need to we need healed, and we need to see history in a new way. And so kind of where we place ourselves in these stories of being needing to have our eyes open and to respond accordingly, Jesus invites Bartimaeus to follow him on the way, and his life goes from there. And in the season of Lent, as it starts tomorrow, it's nice to celebrate Fat Tuesday with y'all. The temptations to power that Jesus undergoes in the wilderness, and reading ourselves into those stories as well. It's so woven through Scripture if we're seeing it through this lens.
Thank you for lifting up some of those stories and lenses, Joel. And I feel like this could be a whole webinar in itself of just going into some of these texts and stories, because we do need help seeing sometimes, especially as white settlers, to see the ways that that's woven in with interpretive help and guidance. I'm going to invite folks, if you do have questions in the chat, feel free to share them, and we'll take time for Q&A at the end. I know, Carol, you might have to bounce early for another webinar, but I understand that another representative from Shalom is going to tag team and take the baton from you at some point, Carrie. When she's ready, just let me know. So my next question is related to the who you offer reparations to, or restitution funds in the budget to. I know, Jim Bear, you've been organizing in Minnesota around Black and Indigenous reparative justice. Joel, with your congregation, as I understand it, you've decided to return funds to Black and Indigenous communities. Other congregations, like I think Shalom Mennonite Fellowship, have offered restitution to Indigenous communities in their region, who they're in relationship with. So if you could just share how you've decided who restitution goes towards. How do you deal also with issues of power? Like even in the releasing of funds, there's decision-making power. Who are you in relationship with as you decide? What, if you could just speak into some of the complexity of the who and the how behind restitution, that'd be helpful. And I'll invite you to start us off, Jim Perry.
Yeah, so you bring up a lot of good questions, none of which I have any substantial answer to. And the reason why I don't have an answer to it is at the Minnesota Council of Churches, we are being very intentional about how we go about reparations. And just for some background, Minnesota Council of Churches is an ecumenical, primarily Protestant organization representing just over 1 million Christian people in the state of Minnesota. We are a membership organization, and our membership is the denominational levels of pretty much all the mainline Protestant denominations in Minnesota. So we do have Mennonite folks there, your typical Lutheran, Presbyterian, Methodists, Greek Orthodox are part of us, and that. And so our program, right, the Truth and Reparations program in the Minnesota Council of Churches, we are basically going to give a charge of reparations to our denominations, and that's a tall order, right? When you consider that we're going to give this charge to bishops and executive directors and all of this, we are taking it, I don't want to say we're taking it slow. We are being intentional. We are being very intentional about how we go about reparations, because what we want to avoid is we want to avoid white congregations or white denominations saying, this is what we're going to do for reparations, and coming to those decisions completely absent of any kind of meaningful relationship, discussion, or conversation with BIPOC people and BIPOC organizations. And I think if you leave white congregations to define their own reparations, it's just going to devolve into charity again, right? And it's not going to address any of the systemic disparities and issues that caused the problem in the first place. So what we are doing for reparations, and we are just now forming a work group. As Katerina said, our program focuses on 2 impact communities, American Indian and African American peoples in the state of Minnesota. And so we are forming a work group of 12 individuals, 6 folks from the Black communities and 6 folk from the Native communities in Minnesota. These are folks who come from a wide variety of backgrounds, from academia, pastoral and ministry, seminary, community organizers, activists. And for the next 12 months, this group is going to conduct meetings, and we are going to define reparations, because the one thing we know in terms of reparations going into this is that reparations cannot be defined by the oppressor. Reparations can only be defined by those who are oppressed. And, you know, we have gotten, since we've announced our program, my inbox was filled with well-intentioned, good, progressive, got all their liberal bona fides, you know, these churches that say, hey, we'd love to partner with you. Here's what we're going to do for reparations. And they list all this stuff. And I'm like, cool. Is this what the Black folks in your area are asking for? Is this what Native people are asking for? Like, where does this come from? Oh, well, this came out of our, you know, our racial justice task force of, you know, First Lutheran Church, which is, it doesn't actually exist, but it's, you know, I'm just saying, you pick a Lutheran church in Minnesota, chances are it's 98% white. And so we're being intentional. We're not putting a timeline on this working group. That's a very indigenous approach, right? The work's going to take as long as it takes. And we don't want to put a timeline on it, because we don't want to say like, all right, stop this very enriching conversation, stop this very enriching work, because, you know, we've got to print a report by the end of the year. So we have identified the members of the working group. I mean, like literally just today, we got our last confirmation of interest in the group, and we are beginning to calendar those out. And we'll hope to have our first meeting probably in April. And you know, the charge for this group is to the work for this group is to create the charge for the faith communities in Minnesota that say they want to be involved in the work of repair and healing. And this is what it's going to look like. And we will have multiple avenues of reparations. We're not going to have one fund, one organization, one anything. Because when you're dealing with, you know, like for us, we're dealing on a statewide level. So we have rural and we have urban dynamics. We have 2 impact communities. So, you know, and there's a spectrum and variation in that. So what is needed on the Red Lake Nation up in northern Minnesota is not necessarily what is needed at the Little Earth housing complex in downtown Minneapolis, which is a Native housing complex. So we've got a lot of work to do, but we have committed to be intentional in how we go about doing it.
Thank you, Jim Bear. And Carol, how about for your community?
Yeah, so we asked Sarah Augustine and Waz and some other folks on Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery Network or Coalition, and local folks here in Tucson for advice on how we should do, like, we got the restitution line, now how do we do this? We got some money. I mean, we did this guidelines question at the same time as we were asking for the money in the budget. And you can read our guidelines in the very lovely collection, Stories of Repair. But I would say some of the ones that I would hold up is that don't pit Indigenous people against each other. Was something that Sarah shared very strongly with us. Follow, like, Indigenous people have written the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People, and that's like, rather than do something else, why don't you follow that as where you want to support, offer support, give back resource that has been taken. And that points to, now it's not in the guidelines, but I think that the word was justice rather than hospice care. So hospice, caring for dying people or contexts is a good thing to do, but if you want to do restitution, support those who are working on justice and for the land, and get behind them. And we talked about either focusing with neighbors in this region or groups that are somehow connected to Shalom's own history. For instance, there was a VS assignment, a voluntary service assignment in the 1970s that was supporting, working for an organization that was taking Indigenous children away from their tribes and families and placing them in foster care and adoption with white families. So part of that scoop generation that followed the residential schools or paralleled it in some decades. So getting behind ICWA and the Indian Child Welfare Act, and NICWA, the organization that does a lot of the legal defense of that very important civil rights law, was one of the first things that we kind of figured out that we should do. One of the things about looking for, like, one of the ways it has changed us to have this budget line item and the responsibility to pay or distribute restitution. I still don't know what the right verb is. I would love some help with that. But one of the things is it makes us keep more in touch with the struggles of Indigenous people who are our neighbors. And that helps us also, like, one of the things Sarah said was differentiate between solidarity and restitution and do both. Yeah, so it doesn't just stay with money. It's like, oh, Amber is defending herself in federal court because she prayed on sacred land at the border that was, the federal government was in the process of destroying with a wall. And sometimes people put out a financial need, so it's obvious. Other times it's been very interesting to interact. The particular people, Apache folks who were partnering with or getting behind on Oak Flat, will not ask for money. Like, it's clear to me that is not something they will do. And I have learned not to ask them to ask for money, but there are ways that I can find out, they're fighting a federal court case. Yeah. So that takes money. I am going to need to leave soon, and Carrie Nelson will probably show her face and
Yes.
join the
Thank
thing.
Carrie now. Thank you,
Blessings
Carol.
on the continuing conversation.
And I'll let Joel respond.
Ken, take notes for me.
I'll let Joel respond while we bring Carrie on, and maybe just pause a second. You asked about verbs. I'm curious, Jim Bear, I've heard different verbs: return, offer, pay. Which ones in the groups that you're working with do you gravitate towards when we talk about this?
Yeah,
Not as charity, not as a transaction, but as justice.
I mean, I feel like in our context here, in the racial justice circles I run, reparations is used widely, that term. And I think really a lot of it, even for Indigenous people, using the term reparations kind of shows a certain level of implied solidarity with Black justice folks who have been using that term reparations. And then also with somewhat renewed attention to the House Resolution 40, HR 40, which names reparations. I don't know. I mean, I'm not a big stickler on what we want to call it, but more often than not, reparations just kind of comes out of my mouth, because I think when we talk about reparations, it's been such a politicized kind of hot button word that it just kind of makes everyone pause, and whether you're like raising your fists in solidarity or you're clutching your pearls, you're responding to that word reparations. So that's my preference, but I don't have any particular convictions for or against any other kind of language around that.
Yeah, thank you, Jim Bear.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we'll let Carol go, and thank you so much, Carol, for joining us. And Joel, if you have just some thoughts to contribute to the how question of how your group went about deciding, and the who of offering reparations or restitution toward.
Yeah, well, I'll pick up with that conversation because we are also on the search for language, and I feel language is really important. So this return is actually new language for me, so I really appreciate that. We are actually not using reparation language, and our reason for that is well, let me back up a little bit as far as the how we came to this. I told a little bit of the story back to 2016, but so this started actually with our board, our church board, as far as the specific budget item. A couple of us watched a webinar a couple of years back with MCUSA did that included maybe like a I don't know, 3 or 4 minute clip of discussing reparations, and there were a couple of suggestions, and that got us talking. And another member of the board who worked a long time in the nonprofit world mentioned that he was always struck how nonprofits don't pay property taxes, and how property taxes, of all the taxes that we pay, are the ones that go toward local uplift, like things we actually generally agree with, like schools and libraries and mental health board, but we don't, some of the same missions that we work for as nonprofits, we're not paying into. And so that we came to the conclusion that because of its tie to place, to localized place, and because of that connection to, we use some of the language we use was to unexempt ourselves from from property taxes as a church. So what would the church be paying in property taxes, which is a lot. I don't know, we haven't done it exactly a lot, but I think our building, it would be over $30,000 for our building in property taxes. So we started in 2021. Our commitment, which we're sticking with for 2 years now, is to start at 5,000 and to step it up 5,000 every year. And maybe we'll get to whatever property taxes we're supposed to pay. So 2021 was 5,000. We're in 2022 now, and it's 10,000. And would like to actually get up to what we would be paying in property taxes, and to challenge members to give above and beyond, and to consider their own stories of where they live, and look into histories as far as that kind of payment that we're making. And then so the board decided that the congregation, surprisingly, it went through the budget without much discussion. I was like, is this a good thing or bad thing that nobody's raising their hand and we're having lots of discussion about it? But it just kind of went through, with, general affirmation, not indifference. And then a committee was appointed to decide the how and the where question. And one of the first things we encountered in some conversations with a couple Black leaders in Columbus was the language of reparation for them, speaking directly to federal level funds for descendants of enslaved persons, that had a very specific designation connotation. And we have since been looking for language. And both the verb, like, are we giving? Oh, no, because it's like, we're giving to you, the charity thing. Are we relinquishing? Like, it was ours, but we're kind of giving it up. The idea of return, that's new language, like the good verb. And then what are we doing? Is this restitution? Restitution is like an alternative to reparation. Repair is like what it is, but it doesn't have that bigger movement type language of reparations. So a search for language that captures it well is one of the questions we're asking, and that's tied to power and everything. And we definitely were not. So we decided in Columbus, there's one main Native American. It's called NACO, Native American Indian Center of Central Ohio, which actually has a land campaign going right now, and they are kind of the central Native American organization in Columbus. So we didn't have any relationship with them before starting that. And Black-led organizations were, here's the question, like Jim Barry, you were getting at, like, well, who decides, like, getting to decide where these funds go? Is itself a form of power? Like, well, we like this group, we like this organization. And so we're a little bit isolated here, because what would be great would be like to keep the local emphasis, but for there to be multiple congregations across Columbus, across Central Ohio, that are actually giving up these funds to a committee that Jim Bear talked about, like a Black and Indigenous led committee that more decides, hey, this is actually where we need these funds right now, rather than an isolated white congregation, predominantly white congregation, saying we choose you and you. But that's where we're at right now, because keeping it local was very important to us, because tying it to our story and our relationships locally, and we kind of prioritize that over. I guess we prioritize local over finding an Indigenous or Black-led group to give it to that would decide where it would go that might not be local. So that's just the decision we made, for better or worse. And
Joel, just one thing with that, I just wanted to clarify for the sake of participants' understanding. From what I understand, you all are not prescriptive in any way around how those funds are used when they're released, relinquished, returned, right?
Correct. Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. The Black-led organization that we decided to give to it's called Be Quick, Black Queer Intersectional Coalition. And we were drawn to them for the intersectional work, but also because they had a mutual aid fund where they decide as an organization where to distribute that money where most needed. And we didn't say, here, this is for your mutual aid fund, but we were especially drawn to that work that they did. And it felt like a Minnow affinity, because we do a similar thing in our congregation for our congregational members.
Can I, Joel, I'd like to ask you a question.
Yeah.
Because I know some of our congregations here in Minnesota are exploring kind of participating in a similar thing. One of the issues they're bumping up against is like the need for the funds to go to a 501c3. Is that something that you're facing there? And you know, once you like start doing this work, you realize the insidiousness of colonialism on every aspect of, like, even doing the repair work. Oh, it has to go to a 501c3 because, you know, we don't want to give funds directly to a Black single mother who, you know, wants to purchase her own home, you know, things like that. So are you facing that? And have there been any conversations around is kind of end arounding that? Or
yeah, I think for us, there were some questions early on about whether funds to individuals were an option, and it's not the 501c3 that's important, because we're not looking for a tax deduction in the giving for that portion. But we did decide to give through an organization that had its own accountability in place and they would decide where most needed. So that was, there was consensus around giving to an organization rather than to individuals.
Thanks for sharing that, Joel. And from what Carol shared, there's a more regional or kind of local context-based approach than what I'm hearing is happening in Minnesota, and some interesting questions that come up with the differences in how this is being structured and the process that's going about. I wanted to see, Carrie, if you had anything to add to this question, and Jim Bear as well, other comments.
Yeah, we also don't have any guidelines on whether or not it's a 501c3 organization. I think our main thing is that we want it to be Indigenous led or Indigenous guided, so that it's not, like Carol said, we did kind of struggle with that. Is this just a continuation of power struggle if we decide what's important to us and where our money is going? Then how do we do this? And also not wanting to pit people against each other, and also not wanting to give donations that could potentially cause fights within a potentially very small agency about what happens with the money. And then the flexibility of payment, like, do you have a bank account? Do you not have a bank account? Do you have a Venmo? Do you need cash? Like, and relinquishing the control over, is this cash sitting in a shoebox under someone's bed, or is this sitting in a savings account at Chase Bank? Like, and trying to be flexible and be open to the fact that not everything is going to look like what you might imagine it, because if we are finding smaller grassroots things that are starting to get up, they may not have that infrastructure, or don't need to follow in the path that says you need to get this, you need to get that, you need to get this to be suitable and acceptable and great in society. So I think that's just one more thing to add, is sort of that financial flexibility of saying, we have funds, how do you need them?
And Carrie, could you share a little more? Carol mentioned NICWA, the organization supporting the Indian Child Welfare Act and its continued observance under US law. What other groups have you all returned funds towards and offered restitution to? If you could share a little bit about those and maybe how you decided.
Sure. So we have been, in the word that popped into my mind is fortunate. And I also think it's not it's not necessarily a good thing, but we have sort of we haven't set out on July 1st when our fiscal year starts and sat down and said, okay, where do we want our money to go? But we've sort of let the year lead us to where it needs to go. And so with like the trial we gave to, I have these notes here. I believe that we gave to the defense fund of this woman who was going on federal trial. And if we had designated our funds July 1, maybe in December when it came up, we wouldn't have had that opportunity. And so I think that's another, not like rushing to the finish line of like, we have this budget line item and we got to get it all spent, but to say like, let's just ride it out and see what comes up and see if an emergency comes up or something new piques our interest, or we find out, we meet someone and we get to say like, great, you have this need and we have this availability. Some places that we have given are the Niqua and Apache Stronghold. We gave to an anti-border collective that was to help the defense fund in protesting the wall. Autumn Against the Wall is again, a solidarity project working with the border wall. And then the Thorn, TOHRN, which is a Tucson-based movement of young people, Autumn Young People. So I think those are the things that I can remember that we have given to, or returns funds to.
Yeah, thank you, Carrie. Jim Bear, it looked like you had something to share.
Yeah, I just, I love the conversation. I love being in a group of people that are actually doing something. But I don't want to miss this opportunity. And we need to address the elephant in the room, which is, if we are going to be people of God who stand in solidarity with Indigenous people, eventually we have to talk about land. And that's just the reality of it. Money's one thing, but listen, I'll speak for myself as an Indigenous person. I don't really care about your money all that much. I mean, don't get me wrong. There's more than enough need for your money. But if we're going to use language like return, we're going to use language like Jubilee, we got to talk about land, because that's a central part of what Jubilee is. And how do we do that? I don't think we have a good model for that. We hear about land return from, ecclesial bodies and congregations and denominations, and that what we usually hear in that context is, oh, the Lutheran campground out in the woods, we can't afford it anymore, so let's give it back to the Indians, right? And then we become the avenue of your financial relief. Or the land gets so used up, the buildings are falling down and you can no longer maintain it, or we hear about land return from a dead and dying congregation that can't afford their building anymore, can't keep it up. And while I'm pleased that, there is some land return happening in that context, my ultimate dream would be that a vibrant, alive congregation, one that's not struggling but is healthy in membership and financial support, so a vibrant, alive congregation would develop a deep and meaningful relationship either with an Indigenous sovereign nation or an Indigenous organization. And we're building that relationship where trust is being established. And then ultimately, that vibrant congregation would say, you know what? we're going to give our land back to this sovereign nation, or we're going to give our land back to this indigenous organization. And if we're going to talk about reparations, we're going to talk about, restitution, it has to involve risk. And we don't want to talk about land back because that's scary. That's frightening. But it's only scary because you're all thinking like colonizers. Because you're thinking, well, if we give the land back, the Indians are going to say, thank you very much, now get the hell out. Because that's what colonizers do. But I'm going to tell you, if you have that relationship with an indigenous organization or a sovereign nation, listen, I introduced myself. I said my tribe's in the middle of, it's 1,100 miles away from our ancestral homelands. We as Indigenous people know better than any other people in the world the pain of dislocating, the pain of being removed. And we wouldn't visit that on any other people. We're not vengeful people. We wouldn't visit that upon you. So my ultimate dream, I would love to see a vibrant congregation worshiping in a space that they don't own any longer. They have no legal tie to it. That they have built that relationship up with Indigenous peoples to such a point that they can legally sign the land over and trust that their Indigenous hosts will allow them to keep using the space. And so I just wanted to name that because and I don't say that to in any way negatively reflect the conversation we have around money. And I'll say Joel, Columbus Mennonite is a church that I have used at the Minnesota Council as an example of a congregation that is actually wrestling with these questions and doing things. But I know if we're going to continue to use the language of Jubilee and Indigenous solidarity, we have to talk about land. There's just no way around it.
Thank you for that charge and challenge, Jim Bear, an invitation to risk taking in the way of Jesus and towards closer relationship with Jesus. I hear this as a discipleship call to us. So thank you. It invites me to re-explore our 7 steps of commitment and restitution in the budget, but also going beyond. And I feel like we have an opportunity to be a part of a theological imagination for the wider church here, to really be thinking about how do we go beyond what is Jubilee and repair really call us to, and that it's different there's a difference between Black and Indigenous communities when we talk about repair there as well. That is a distinction I hear you making too. Yeah, thank you. Any responses from panelists?
Yeah, thank you. Not just wealth, but the source of wealth is what this is about, and things that can't be measured in dollars, but are connections to place and to land. One thing I'll add that the how question, I want to be clear that so far our gifts, they just look kind of like donations as far as how we're giving to the organization, because we've just done it once. And we decided that we weren't going to say, here's your reparation money. And it was like, man, how do you even give this in a way that isn't just giving? How do you return it? And so we have not communicated this aspect of why we're giving yet to these two organizations, one Indigenous led, one Black led, half and half is how we're dividing the money. We're still working on how to even communicate if like what the best approach to that is. So they looked like donations, and we did ask the best way that they would like to receive them. For example, in Columbus, there's a big give day where sometimes some organizations giving can actually get matched by this pool of money. And so like we asked that, for example, like, would this be the best day to give, or when, and in what form? But we did not yet, have not yet had these kinds of conversations with the organizations to which we have returned the money.
Thanks, Joel. From working with a group of Indigenous advisors on the Stories of Repair resource, one phrase that came up from that work was symbolic repair, or symbolic, I don't know what it was called, Jim Bear, symbolic reparations, because it's acknowledging that it's not complete. You can't ever make up for the actual harm done of lives stolen and land lost, and so much that's been lost. And so all of these are symbolic but real, and hopefully transformative for the people returning, as well as helpful for the ones who are receiving and being returned to, but yet it's a small step. So I appreciate that in Columbus Mennonite and other congregations' language is that this is a small step along the way. It's not attempting to be the whole. I also just want to make a pitch to folks in the audience. I'm part of a group right now of faith leaders who are part of a working group working with the Indian Collective. You can see more in the link in the chat, landback.org. And they want to create a resource. Crystal Tubles, the organizer, has said churches own a great deal of land across the world to church communities. And we need you all to speak to your own communities, theologically, biblically, offer a framework for land back. And so right now we're forming a working group. So if anyone's interested in joining or has suggestions of people who would be good contributors to that, we want to create resources to what Jim Bear is saying here. That's not just financial, but land return kinds of jubilee, as well as state or federal lands. So a plug there. But I want to open it up to questions from the audience and from the group. I received one in the chat. Maybe this question gets at the restitution versus solidarity kind of distinction that I think Carol talked about. One participant said, I've been involved with a group whose motto was change, not charity. How do panel members feel about supporting systemic change for Indigenous people versus direct costs of Indigenous peoples? So feel free to clarify the person who put that in the chat, but the question was around supporting systemic change versus direct costs.
Yeah, I mean, systemic change is the only kind of change that I'm at all interested in. Otherwise, we're not actually doing anything. We're just releasing our comfort at the expense of the next generations, right? Because, you know, what happens when Columbus Mennonite isn't around? And yet the systems are still in place that create the disparities. And I think anything we do that doesn't address systemic change ultimately has a potential to fall into the old models we're all familiar with in the church world of charitable benevolence. And that for me, so when we talk about dismantling the doctrine of discovery, we can talk about the praxis of that all we want, and we see, like, even demonstrated here this evening, models of praxis for that. But when we talk about dismantling that, right? The Mennonites are part of a slew of Christian denominations that have repudiated the doctrine of discovery, which is great. But what does that mean? How do you repudiate something that is so endemic that we all benefit from it, whether we want to or not? And I include myself in that. I own the home that I'm talking to you from right now. I could not own this home if the treaties that were negotiated with the Dakota people in this land were upheld. So I am building generational wealth at the expense of my Indigenous relatives here in Minnesota. It's so pervasive. How do we repudiate that? But also, when we look at, I am beyond pissed off that our forebearers in the faith sold their spiritual inheritance for a bowl full of political power. Because now the story of Christ has become damaging and traumatizing to people in my community. And when we read the gospel narrative, when we read the Hebrew scriptures from an Indigenous lens, that the Jesus we were all sold is not who Jesus is. It's just not. I mean, I grew up in a church that had Jesus, wrapped in the American flag and sporting pistols on his hips, right? And it's just like, that's not who Jesus is. And so when we talk about undoing the doctrine of discovery, dismantling the doctrine of discovery, repudiating the doctrine of discovery, what we need to do, because the damage, some of the fundamental damage that has been done by the doctrine of discovery is it has dehumanized Black and brown people. It has dehumanized. And charity does nothing to give me my humanity back. It's good work. It's oftentimes appreciated. Look, I grew up in a single wide trailer park. I was the recipient of charity all my life. I was appreciative of it, but nothing about it ever restored my humanity. And so if we're gonna dismantle, if we're gonna use these words like dismantle, repudiate, we have to restore humanity. And that's a door that swings both ways. You all, as white people, as settler colonizers, you're not human either. It's just that you are not human in a system that supports your inhumanity. So you don't feel it. And so when we do this work, right? And I mean, I would like to maybe open this up for a conversation about, to Joel and Carrie or others who are doing this work, like, how has this work brought humanity back to you, right? Because I think that's when we are really moving away from a charitable model. Because like I said, charity does nothing to restore my humanity. And quite frankly, it does nothing to restore your humanity. So there's an inhumanity both in those that are oppressed and in those that are in the positions of power. And so I sorry, Katerina, I don't mean to take this over, but I think I would love to hear, not, you know, because we've heard about what's going on, you know, in these congregations and all of that, but I would love to hear about the return that you may have felt from that work. Like, do you feel more human?
That's a great question, Jim Bear, and it has echoes of your sharing about Zacchaeus, who was restored to community and to Christ's community in the process. So let's maybe in the next 2 or 3 minutes before we close, Joel and Carrie, if you want to respond to that, and then I'm going to actually bring us back to the gallery view away from spotlight as we respond, so we can all see one another's faces, and then I'll turn it back to you, Jim Bear, for any closing words. Go ahead, Joel or Carrie.
Okay, I can go. I was trying to find, I lost myself on the screen. Yeah, so, yeah, definitely seeing this as soul work, and the learning. I would say the most transformative aspects so far has been personal family history, learning, kind of seeing that in a new light, and church, seeing our stories and place and relationships in a new light. I feel like it's fresh enough that we almost, like, we hope we're being transformed, but we don't quite know if we're being transformed. And I'm personally a relational person, and it hasn't been very relational work so far. And because part of what we've tried to relinquish is demanding a relationship from the people who get the funds. It's like, here, we're donating money, and now we want you to be our friends, and come speak and do this and have this special relationship with us, which I really hope develops over time. But we're not there yet to the relational piece, and I think that's where more transformation happens. So I think we're kind of like, hopefully, we're like opening our actions lead the way to making ourselves available for transformation, I guess is how I might put that.
I really appreciate this charge and challenge and question, because I think the way that my brain works, it's so easy for me to say, like, well, this is the meeting that I need to be in from 5 to 7, and this is the meeting that I'm going to go to on Friday from 11 to 12, and to like schedule it and block it out, and to maybe remove some of that humanity and to fit it neatly into boxes in my life of, these are the times that I focus on this because it's the committee work or it's the meeting work. And I think to bring more humanity and less of this bureaucracy, because that's what we're trying to get rid of, this systemic bureaucracy that harms people. And I think I'm so conditioned to put things into boxes and to schedule things that now I'm almost faced with a like, wow, I have maybe lost some of what needs to be here in humanizing this and my own humanity and other people's humanity. So I will take this challenge very much to heart and continue to wrestle with, how has this work humanized me, and how is it going to humanize other people? Because I think maybe too bluntly, honestly, I'm realizing like I need more of that. So thank you.
I really appreciate that framing of becoming more human. And I'm just, we talked about names. We've been talking about names. I'm thinking of Jesus' most common name for himself as the Son of Man, the human one, basically like the most human of human ones, and the call to become more human. So thank you for that framing.
Thank you both. Before I turn it back to Jim Bear, I just wanted to add one little additional learning for us, especially for white folks, is just making mistakes and learning from those mistakes, and that it's okay to make mistakes. Like one of the marks of white supremacy is perfectionism. And in this work myself, I've had to learn to get past my mistakes and get over myself, because that's part of the process of becoming more human. So I invite us all into mistake making and learning from those mistakes, obviously not for the point of offending people, but for moving forward towards justice. So yeah, that's the last thing I'll share in response to your question, Jim Bear, and then turn it back over to you for the last word. And I'll put our next meeting date in the chat as you close us out.
Yeah, well, I just want to first of all, I'll take 1 second. Pat, I see your question there about Makoche Ikikchupe. It's a land recovery in Minnesota. I'm going to just lift up John Stays as a resource for that. He's on this call. He's a friend, colleague of mine, has close ties to that organization. And I'll just say, I love that organization. I wish they didn't have to buy their own land back, but that's the state of things that we are right now. But for more information, and if I'm not mistaken, Katerina, the Makoche Ikikchupe is kind of lifted up in the resource.
That's right.
So yeah. So I just wanted to, I saw your question there, Pat, and wanted to address that. I recognize sometimes that I can come off quite strongly. I can come off as critical of the Christian church, because I am critical of the Christian church with good reason. But I am critical because I believe that there is a salvation for the church itself that comes only through relationship with historically marginalized people. We know Christianity was never meant to hold political power. And yet that's been the bulk of our history, the overwhelming arch of Christian history. In 2016, as the entire world's eyes were on a river crossing in Cannonball, North Dakota, right next to the Standing Rock Reservation, a call came out for clergy, for a physical presence. Somewhere around 600 clergy responded from all across the nation. Mennonite clergy, Lutheran clergy, UCC, Jewish clergy. 600 or so clergy folks respond, and it's an overwhelming show of presence, and it was beautiful. And a friend of mine from Minneapolis, she's a UCC pastor, responded to that call, and she, upon returning back to Minneapolis, she recounted for me what had happened out there, in that the 600 clergy collectively came together, somehow procured or produced a copy of the Doctrine of Discovery, and then they publicly burned it right there out at Standing Rock. And it's beautiful. And I'll say that. That's beautiful. But when my friend was telling me this, I told her, I said, Rebecca, that's great. But where you need to burn the Doctrine of Discovery is not out there amongst the native people. We already know that this is bullshit. We know that. We've always known that. You need to take the doctrine of discovery to the steps of your church. That's where you need to burn it. And let this lead to a deep dive of your own settler colonial framing of everything. And so I'm just going to leave you with that. I think in doing this work, right? You know, so much of what I do is informed out of those 3 lines of scripture out of Matthew chapter 5. Like, if we're not going to be about this work, then we should really stop calling ourselves people of God, because that's what Jesus is explicitly saying. Don't give your offering, because it won't be accepted if you're not going to be about the work of actually being an agent of salvation, which is to save and to heal. So I loved my time tonight. I don't always get refreshed or recharged in these kind of conversations, but this one I feel very good about. And again, it's good to see so many familiar and friendly faces in this space.
Thank you so much, Reverend Jim Bear, Joel, Carrie, Carol, and to all of you and the places and congregations you represent. Let's continue moving forward together, taking steps towards action and towards true Jubilee. And I'm going to use that word because Jim Bear has invited us to feel the tension of the not yet as we long for the kingdom to come, and that's already here. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jim Bear, for that word. We'll regather on June 1st, same time, and I'll send out another registration link to everyone. Take care, everyone. Good night.